Good evening and welcome. I am Terry Kay of the Jewish Grandparents Network. Tonight, we are thrilled that Nadine Epstein is here to talk to us about her friendship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and why our grandchildren need great role models. First, for 1 minute, I am going to show you something new in the family room. Many of you know the family room is a place for grandparents to find experiences that bring Jewish culture and values and traditions to our relationships with our grandchildren. Here we have the family room, and I'm going to take you to show you very quickly, 1 minute, our new destination, travel. We've just opened up this new category called travel, and in it we offer you all kinds of what we hope are meaningful travel experiences for you and your grandchildren. I will show you one experience called Planning a Trip to Israel with Your Teen Grandchild, written by two Israeli tour guides, ex-Americans, and they give us some wonderful ideas for sharing a trip to Israel with our grandchildren. As many of you know, the family room is an asynchronous experience, meaning you do it in your own time when it suits you. And now, again, welcome. We are so happy you joined us. Let's move to tonight's agenda events. We are in webinar format, meaning that only the hosts and the panelists can be seen and heard. If you have a question, please write it in the chat box and we will take questions throughout. Tonight, Nadine will be in conversation with David Raphael, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Jewish Grandparents Network. Hello, David. Our wonderful board member, Ruth Nemzoff, will introduce Nadine. And first, a word about Ruth. Ruth is the author of, get ready, Don't Roll Your Eyes, Making In-Laws into Family, and Don't Bite Your Tongue, How to Foster Rewarding Relationships with Your Adult Children. Ruth is an affiliated scholar at Brandeis Women's Studies Research Center. She is on our board, a valued member of our board and a dear friend, and is also on the board of 18 Doors, Unlocking Jewish. Over to you, Ruth.
Well, I'd like to add the board's welcome to all of you and our hopes that you will not only come enjoy tonight, but you'll come back for other lectures and also come to our website very often. Now, I'd like to tell you about Nadine. Nadine Epstein has written a book about women who inspire. And of course, she is one. She has inspired me, even though she's many years younger. So she has written numerous books and articles in op-eds for the Post, the Washington Post, the Smithsonian, Newsweek, the New York Times. And she's the founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change and the founder of the Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative, and also of Moment Books. But what really matters to me is that she's the editor of Moment magazine, a magazine which I just love because it doesn't shy away from any controversial Jewish issues and it presents all the sides. So I introduce you to Nadine, and I think it's going to be a good evening. Nadine.
Thank you. Thank you. We present as many sides as we can possibly fit in because, as we all know, there's infinite sides, but it's true. We really try to do that. Thank you so much. Thank you for that lovely, sweet introduction.
Well, good evening, all. I want to say, first of all, how wonderful it is to be surrounded by such remarkable women. I know all of the three women who I could see on my desk, and each one is more wonderful than the next. And we are really just so honored, for instance, that Nadine has joined us and that Ruth is a member of our leadership group. I learn something from her every time we talk. So I'm going to be asking Nadine some questions, but we're also going to be taking questions from you folks. And so we invite you to add your questions. So I'm just going to start by saying, Nadine, first of all, thank you, but I'd love to hear how you got to know Justice Ginsburg.
Well, as you heard, I'm the editor of Moment, and it turned out that she was a devoted reader of Moment. And I realized this after, well, I went to interview her, and maybe 10 years ago, and she was so excited about the interview, and then she had me send it to 20 of her favorite friends. And then also I realized that she was always, I went back and realized she'd been making donations to Moment every year. You know, she was just part of the Moment family, and we became friends. And I interviewed her a few times, and I helped her with some projects, some philanthropic projects that she, like when she would be given big awards and she wanted help finding good, worthy causes for women, to help women. So although I don't do that, I just helped her with that. She asked me, and I certainly didn't say no. And then in 2019, we honored her, and we gave her our first Human Rights Award. And it was in New York at the Yale Club. And we made this incredible collar for her. We commissioned a collar called the Zedek collar, made out of Belgian lace, and we had it designed. And we gave it to her, and she loved it so much that she asked me to come to her chambers, which I'd been to before, and hand deliver it. So I did, and that's how the whole conversation about the book started, is in that particular visit.
That's wonderful. You know, I mean, so Justice Ginsburg is just an icon for the ages, and for all of us, and certainly for the Jewish community. And we so admire her, but I for one, know so little about her. Maybe we all do, other than her record on the Supreme Court. Why is she so important to us, and what do you see as her legacy?
So, we started this book from this conversation, and it turned out it was in October of 2019. Of course, we had no idea that she was going to die in less than a year. But she basically, so when she died in the sort of in the process of the book, I added a whole chapter on her into the book. And I did that because so many people just know she's famous, she's notorious, she was a Supreme Court justice, but really she was important for having come up and actually done the legal strategy of the workaround, which is using the 14th Amendment to get us to some kind of semblance of gender equity in this country. She saw it as a workaround. It wasn't actually her idea. I think Pauli Murray and other women, including her, came up with it together or at the same time, but she's the one who mapped that legal strategy. And that was incredibly important. And that's really why, even more important than what she did on the Supreme Court. Of course, she was also the second woman on the Supreme Court, the first Jewish woman on the Supreme Court, and a woman who was very much aware of her Jewishness and very Jewish, despite some people saying that she wasn't. She was an incredibly Jewish woman. And this book was a really important part of her Jewish journey and her Jewish legacy, and her legacy in general, because it was how she really expressed her Judaism, was by thinking about these women and she really wanted to tell their stories for the next generations and for the current generations. So.
Well, I want to go out of order. I know I sent you the questions, and I always deviate from them.
I'm not looking at them. Go anywhere you want.
But okay. Well, you had me at a devoted reader of Moment, and I said, well, that's something, her Jewish identity. And then you said, she's very Jewish. And I just, could you tell us a little bit about her, her connection to Jewish life?
Yes. So I was so shocked, like when she died, people were going, oh, she's barely Jewish. That couldn't be further from the truth. This is a woman who grew up in Brooklyn, whose mom grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family, who went to, attended a conservative synagogue, was a very dutiful student going to Hebrew school after school and on the weekend, who actually really learned her lessons and learned her Torah, who went to Jewish summer camp, and again, was very serious about all this. Unlike me, who did some of those same things, but was a lot less serious about it. So she really cared. But when she was 16, the day before she graduates from high school, her mom dies, and she's not allowed to participate in the prayers in the minyan during the Shiva. And that so horrifies her. She writes about this. She just throws her, she just sort of rejects traditional Judaism, which was traditional Judaism, patriarchal Judaism of the time. So, but she still has kind of imbibed all these stories of the women in the Haggadah and in the Bible and in the Old Testament. And that stays with her. And her whole life, she's reading about these women. And she's reading about other amazing Jewish women like Henrietta Zold, who she learned about from her mom, and Emma Lazarus, who she learned about from her mom. So she really, Lillian Wald. And then as she gets older, she learns about more of them. So then many years, fast forward many years later, she's Supreme Court Justice. She realizes that one of her clerks, Ari Holtzblatt, has a wife who's a rabbi. And she's just so delighted. She's so excited. And she reaches out to her, and she actually starts occasionally attending. So Rabbi Lauren Holtzblatt is at Adas Israel here in DC, which is the largest conservative synagogue. So Justice Ginsburg starts occasionally showing up and going to, and even writes some midrash with Rabbi Holtzblatt. So she's so excited about this. So she does, in a way, kind of return to a little bit more traditional Judaism, or at least, observant Judaism. But she's, again, really focused on, she's doing this because women are now part of it. So here we are in 2019. She's written a little bit about these women that inspire her. And that's what inspires our conversation. And they're so important to her. And here she is, she's frail. We don't know if her cancer is gonna come back, but she's already very frail. We were just talking about women. I was telling her about how when I was a nerdy kid, I read every single biography in my school library in 4th and 5th grade. And of those 350 books, 10 were about women. Amelia Earhart, Clara Barton, Molly Pitcher, Louisa May Alcott. So, and I was telling her how disappointed I was. So I said, we should write a book. And I say this all the time because, I get excited about topics, and I just said, we should write a book. And Justice Ginsburg just said, yes. And so for her to say yes to a project like that means it's really important to her. And she spent a lot of time on this, and she wanted these women to be part of her legacy.
Wow. I want to talk about the book in a minute, but something you mentioned a couple of things that I found quite interesting, specifically around the Shiva of her mom, where she wasn't allowed to participate in the prayers. But earlier on, you spoke about her advocacy on behalf of women and women's rights and try to get equality for women's rights. Yeah. Do you see a connection between those two events, the kind of her anger, frustration about being closed out of kind of the minyan, and her strong commitment for women's rights and women's equality?
Well, I wouldn't say that she was an angry person, because she didn't strike me as
I didn't mean that.
A woman of anger. she was a strategic thinker, not a person who reacted in anger. But of course, so remember her mom, Celia Bader, to whom the book is dedicated. Originally, it was going to be dedicated to her mom, Celia Bader, and my mom, but then Justice Ginsburg died, and so it's also to her. But her mom grew up in an Orthodox family, and her parents only didn't have a lot of money, and they spent what money they had and sent her brother to college, and not Celia Bader to college. So she grew up. Her mom was definitely mad about that, and her mom saved money for Ruth to go to college. So she grew up the daughter of somebody who was already, giving her lots of messages that you can be an independent woman. You can, you can make a difference. You have to be, you can do well in school. I mean, she got these messages from her mom. And she was also very inspired by like the story of Deborah and the judge who's in the book, the Judge Deborah. So I would very much say that her values come really straight out of, Judaism. Absolutely. And so that's another way in which when people say, oh, she didn't go to synagogue her whole life. Well, who cares? This is a woman who lived her Judaism. Many people don't go to synagogue their whole life. This is a woman who really made her Judaism real and shared it with the nation through her beliefs and through the laws that she helped to pass.
Keep on thinking about tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice you should pursue.
Yes.
I would talk about one more question. You would talk a little bit about her Jewish identity, but I would be remiss as the co-founder of the Jewish Grandparents Network if I didn't ask about her role as a Jewish grandmother. We'll talk more about that later, but perhaps you could say a couple words about that now.
So I think that was a role she took very seriously. First of all, I met many of her grandchildren because she actually invited them to come when we honored her. We actually honored her twice. The first time she couldn't show up, by the way, it was in DC. And because she had just broken her ribs 3 days before. So Nina Totenberg pinch hitted for her. So some of her family came to that, but a number of her grandchildren came to the New York event. And she was very, very involved with her grandchildren's lives. And they spent a lot of time with her, especially as she got to be older. So she was a very active grandma. I've heard some great grandma stories. I think she was maybe a little less active of a mom because she was so busy, and she had this incredible husband who was, kind of the liberated man, quote unquote, before that was such a thing, who was very hands-on at home. But she seemed like she was a very hands-on grandma.
Wonderful. So tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, I mean,
yeah.
Here's a picture of it. It has beautiful art. The Random House allowed the editor and I got to choose the artist. It's just all the way through beautiful art. It's for ages 10 through 120. It's meant to be an intergenerational book to start conversations. It's not written down to kids. It's just written straight, from the heart. It is, I added a whole section. She wrote an introduction for it. I added a whole chapter on her, a whole section on her. And I added also something that we had talked about, which was, a call to action. Because in essence, the stories of these women is the stories of the evolution of women's rights. Jewish and not Jewish. I mean, the women in this book tell the story. And, but the call to action is really important because it's about, and you can ask me about this, but where do we go from here? And that's a really important conversation to have. Anyways, what else would you like to know about it? And it has an amazing woman. She picked some. Oh, the other thing is that, of course, so first off, she had so many women she wanted to include in the book. We ended up with like 150 women. I chose some. She chose some of the other women. Chose some. We mostly ended up with women that she wanted in the book, but I added some other women because all the women chosen would have been lawyers, writers, or singers, or musicians. And I felt like we really needed to have a wider variety. And she agreed. And so I didn't even know about some of the women that she suggested. And she didn't really know that much about the women I suggested. And so we learned about each other's women, which was a great experience, wonderful experience.
Well, I want to follow up on that in a minute, but it sounds like she was an active participant in the kind of the creating, the framing, and the writing of the book. What was that like working with this incredible icon in preparing this book? What was it like working with Justice Ginsburg?
First of all, I was like, she said yes, and then suddenly we were on this journey. We had to figure out what the journey of the book was. And I didn't really expect her to be as involved in the whole process. So, I thought we would select the women, she would write the introduction, and then I was going to be working on the other parts. As it turned out, she read every single word of the first draft of the book. And she edited every single word of the first draft of the book. She was very, very, like, she wasn't like a hands-off person. She really cared a lot about it. So, that turned out to be a very educational experience, to be edited by Justice Ginsburg. She sent me back an entire draft with notes over every single page. I disagree. Wrong word. All sorts of. She was a very serious editor. I realized that she edited her law clerks similarly and edited other people in the same way. But the first time I got all the edits, my heart dropped, because she had told me, well, everything that my writing was so good and professional, and she was happy to do this book with me. And then I sent her a draft, which, by the way, because of timing, I had to, my first draft, I only had 2 weeks to write it, a first draft, which is impossible. But when I was starting the book, really, by the time it was sold and by the time we had picked all the women, and she was really busy, and I have 5 full-time jobs and I run Moment. By the time I started, it was July 2019 and 2020. And it was, oh, by the way, and then we had COVID and lockdowns and, so, and I rented a cabin in Virginia to go and just focus on starting the book. And as soon as I got there, I got an email from her saying, I'm ready to look at the book now. And first of all, I didn't know she was going to look at the book. And second of all, I hadn't written the book. So I very politely said, well, could I have, can I have 10 more days or two more weeks? And she said, okay, but I only have July to look at the book, because in August, I had to be preparing for my oral arguments and preparing for all the court term. So this is my time now to look at it. This is, of course, just 2 months before she dies, and she already has cancer, but the reason why she's in a rush is because she has to focus on the term. So I wrote something as fast as I possibly could. So it was, not up to my standards, but anyways, I sent it to her and she sent it back with these comments, copious comments. So after my heart dropped, and then I shed a few tears because I felt like I had disappointed her, I realized that every single comment she made was a way for me to learn about how she thought. Every comment was incredibly meaningful, and I learned so much about her just from that edit. So it turns out that was a gift. I obviously had to write several drafts after that, but I tried to keep to her. I was trying to keep to her tone to some extent as well as I could in the book, in the book process.
May I jump in? Thank
Yeah.
you, Nadine, with a quick question from one of our participants, from Beth, and then I think David's going to move on to other role models. So Beth asks, how did Ruth Bader Ginsburg contribute to her grandchildren's Jewish education?
So I can't answer that question because I never had that conversation with her. I'm not sure that I just simply don't know. And it would have to be how you define a Jewish education also would have to be a whole conversation. But she was not, again, she wasn't a member of a synagogue for many, many years. I don't even know if her kids had went to had a Jewish education. I just don't know the answer to that.
So I wanted to follow up before we move on. I want to talk about role models in a minute, but I wanted to follow up on something that you said that I found so interesting. You said that you got to know each other's women. That is to say, by seeing the folks that she had identified said something about her, and the folks that you had identified said something about you. What did you see in the choices that she made? I was interested that she chose singers and musicians as well as judges and writers.
Well,
But
first off, the first thing she said that also surprised me when we decided we're in her chambers and we're talking about doing the book. She goes, "We have to have all the women from the Haggadah. They have to be in the book." And I was like, "Really?" And she said, Miriam, Yocheved, Pharaoh's daughter, Shifra, the midwives, and have to be in the book. And I said, "Is Pharaoh's daughter, was she even Jewish?" And she goes, "It doesn't really matter if she was Jewish. She was one of the women who assured the survival of the Jewish people. They have to be in the book." So they are in the book. And so is Deborah, who she really wanted to be in the book. So right off that, so she also, Rebecca Gratz, Fanny Mendelssohn, she had to be in the book because Fanny Mendelssohn was Felix Mendelssohn's sister, who may have been a more talented musician and even performer, but who wasn't allowed to perform or publish her music. And Justice Ginsburg this was just a travesty. Emma Lazarus, she grew up on Emma Lazarus in New York. Lillian Wald. I mean, a lot of these women we agreed on. Henrietta Sold, who is far more, I mean, I thought, oh, she's the founder of Hadassah. She's like this incredible activist, intellectual, way, way ahead of her time. She's an amazing woman. She wanted Gertrude Berg to be in the book. Very important. She grew up listening to Gertrude Berg with her family on the radio and knew right then and there that Gertrude Berg was a woman who was not afraid to be she had her own media company. She wasn't just an actor or a writer. She owned the rights to her work and she supported her family at a time where women didn't do that because they might embarrass their husbands because their husbands couldn't support them well enough. So she really cared about her. Rita Levi-Montalcini, who is a neurobiologist who won the Nobel Prize in medicine, she had met her. She actually met a couple of the women in the book. Another one being, there's only one woman in the book, by the way, that I met, and that's Muriel Siebert, and Justice Ginsburg met her too. And she was, I put her in the book. I think she's just the most amazing woman. This is a woman who really fought her way onto the New York Stock Exchange, which was a complete boys club, and was so far ahead of her time in terms of, diversifying employment, having diversified employees and teaching financial literacy. Just a brilliant woman who I just happened to meet on a train one day, maybe when I was 20 years old. I was taking the train from New York to Philadelphia, and there was an empty seat besides me. And this is how the world works. And Muriel Siebert, who I don't know, there's no Google, I can't look her up, just she sits down next to me, she gets on, and she was in a helicopter crash that day. And she proceeds to tell me her life story because she almost died in a helicopter crash and she wasn't gonna fly home. So she was taking the train home, and it was just like an incredible experience. Bessie Margolin, who is this pioneering lawyer for equal rights and equal pay for women, was on Justice Ginsburg's list. Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, she wanted, but Betty, we didn't quite agree on Betty Friedan. Nadine Gordimer, Anne Frank. Oh, she adored Anne Frank. Anne Frank as a feminist, a writer and a feminist. And Roberta Peters, who was an American soprano, who she grew up on, who performed at the Met. I added Salome Alexandra, who is like this incredible queen, a monarch of Israel, of Judea, who gets nobody talks about her at all, but she's really one of the best leaders of Judea and Israel, the Israelites and she's not it, and she's like even written about by male historians like Flavius Josephus, who don't write about women at all. And she laid the whole groundwork for rabbinic Judaism after the Second Temple fell. So she's just an incredibly amazing woman. I added Gracia Mendes Nasi, an incredibly visionary. I don't know if Justice Ginsburg had ever heard of Gracia Mendes Nasi or Salome Alexandra. I added Emmy Noether, who's an incredible mathematician who couldn't have suffered more gender and religious discrimination. I mean, it's just a brilliant woman.
Nadine, I'm gonna interrupt you for a second, because if you don't mind, because you're giving all these amazing names.
There's so many, yeah.
Just if you would Can you share one woman that, for instance, I may not have ever heard of, who I should know, or or you think is really special?
Okay, so Ernestine Rose. Ernestine Rose, there should be a movie about Ernestine Rose. This woman is amazing. She grows up in a town in Poland where her dad is the rabbi. He's a very strict rabbi. Her mom dies when she's 16 and leaves her a small fortune. Her dad promises that fortune and her hand to a man he's decided she should marry. She talks to her dad. He doesn't want to back down. He's very, sure he's doing the right thing. She goes by herself to the next town and sues her father in civil court, acting as her own lawyer, and wins her freedom and her money. She takes just enough money to leave Poland and become an entrepreneur, and gives the rest of the money back to her dad, and goes off, becomes an entrepreneur in Europe, falls in love with somebody who's just, she found herself, eventually ends up in the United States, where she becomes one of the leading suffragists of the movement. I mean, she is, along with like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she is one of the founders of National Women's Suffrage Association, along with Stanton and Susan Anthony. We don't even hear about her. And she was a fiery speaker. She was like so in demand. And she also spoke up against anti-Semitism. And there was a huge amount of anti-Semitism at the time. And she spoke up about that. And talk about intersectionality. This woman she believed that you should have abolition and women's rights at the same time. Now, that faction didn't win out. That's not what happened. And maybe there's reasons why that didn't happen. But she was so far ahead of her time. And I feel like she moved to England and died in obscurity, and no one really ever talks about her, but she was really one of the 3 women who led the suffragist movement in the United States.
That's extraordinary. That's extraordinary. I mean, so many characteristics that I begin to think of as a role model. But if you were going to, I mean, at this point, you're somewhat of an expert on role models. And what would you describe, or what do you see as the characteristics of a role model?
Well, that's a great question. So I had this conversation with Justice Ginsburg. So my philosophy of role models is not that it's like the person. It's not like you meet somebody who you're going to, worship, or you're going to, we want to be just like that person. What you're really doing is you're identifying traits in people that you find admirable, that you want to incorporate into yourself. This is a lifelong process. It probably starts maybe when we're in 4th grade and we're beginning to think about the world in 5th grade, but it never ends. You're always meeting people, whether it's a famous person or not a famous person, or whether it's somebody you read about in a book. So the question is, it's not the person, but what is that trait? And so you have to have a lot of role models, which is something we thought about when we did this book. There are different ways each one of these women wields power. Each one of them does things differently. They have different admirable traits. So our job as grown-ups, as parents and grandparents, is to identify like traits, first of all, that we admire in other people, but help our kids and our grandchildren to identify traits, to learn how to read people, and to learn how to identify those traits. And I think it's a really important part of emotional intelligence skills. I have to say, it's not one I grew up with. I couldn't, I wouldn't been able to tell the difference between, I couldn't read a trait if you had paid me. It was just a long, hard way to be able to learn that. And now I learn from so many people, and I often have to pick one thing I'm learning from them, or maybe it's 2 things. And then through that, I have been able to, build myself as a person who, a person who's more meaningful to myself in a way, by learning, by absorbing the traits that I admire in others, if that makes sense.
I want to follow up on that in a minute, but I think we have a question. Terry, did we have a question from somebody?
We have, we've responded to it.
Oh, we did.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Well, the phrase that immediately came to mind for me is Ezehu Hacham Olamed Mikol Adam, who is the wise person, the person who learns from all others. And it sounds to me that that's something we need to concentrate on or focus on. It's just not something that just comes naturally. And so I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, that, you know, what can we do not only to be more aware of our role as role models and become better role models, but also help our grandkids learn from others who are role models as well. And then actually I have another interesting question there.
Well, hold that question so I can answer that one. So I was laughing only because that's the whole point for Moment. That's the whole reason Moment exists in my mind. And if you go online to our big question project at momentmag.com, you'll see that whole project is based on that quote, because that's how, you know, that's how we learn, and we have to think about it, and we have to put that into action. And I try to put that quote into action through Moment. So what can we do? How can we teach this to our kids? A bunch of different ways. I think you can, if you think about what you've learned from different people, you can share that with them. You know, it can be what you learned from their mom or their dad, what you learned from reading a book about, you know, Moses, what you learned from reading a book about, you know, Emma Lazarus. So if you kind of think about this yourself and then kind of talk about it. So when you read a book with them, you can say, well, here's what I learned from this person. Here's a trait that not just what I learned, here's the trait I admire from this person that I think I would like to have more of. And then you can say, hey, well, is there something that you saw in this person that you would like to have more of? So it's almost in a way, you know, it's kind of an educational game, but I think it's something that we don't really think about when we're reading to our kids and our grandchildren, that we could do more of that. And I think it's really having this sort of, so you're really embedding this consciousness in them that they can use when they're reading their whole lives. And even when they're in college and they're reading for other reasons, and they're reading to analyze this and do, but they still have this one frame in their mind, which is one, you know, this question that they ask themselves, well, what can I learn from this person? I just think that's critical. And I feel like we don't teach this. It doesn't get taught in school. And so it's something that really can be taught by grandparents.
You know, it seems to me that in the effort to teach our grandparents, our grandkids how to become role models, there's a quality of kind of awareness or mindfulness that is involved, that in an effort for us to become better sharers of role models, we become better role models. That if we're more aware of the things that we see in others and that we admire and begin to identify that, we elevate ourselves individually. I mean, I always knew that here I am in Baltimore, I always admired Cal Ripken, and I couldn't quite figure out why. And you know, I finally put some words to it, that, you know, he's a person who worked hard and played by the rules, and he was a mensch. But it just seems to me, Nadine, that if we focus on being able to share what it means to be a good role model, we in fact can become better people ourselves.
I would agree. I think I wish I had thought about this more when I was, you know, a young parent. I think now that I think about this, I'm much better at, I have grown kids, but well, I'm not a grandparent yet, by the way. But that I'm a much better parent because I think about this now. It allows me to be able to articulate things in a way I couldn't articulate them before, in a much clearer way. And by the way, somebody asked in the chat a really important question, or made a really important comment, which I that it's not just about famous people. Yes, you may be reading a book about famous people, or this conversation comes up about Justice Ginsburg. But as I always tell my son, I've used to tell my son, you know, it might be the bus driver who is the person that you're going to learn from today, because everybody has some kind, almost everyone has some kind of wisdom. And so it's our job in a way to search for that wisdom, which brings us back to Perché vote. And to remember that also helps us to really think about how we connect with people, makes us a much, much better person to be thinking in that kind of using that construction in terms of being a human and also being a teacher to our students and to the next generations.
You know, one of the things that'd be interesting to hear from grandparents on the call, and maybe parents as well, is, you know, what are we learning about being role models from our grandkids? That this is not a one-way deal. I mean, I look at my granddaughter Bina, and I so admire her strength of character and her, you know, assertiveness at the age of, you know, 2 and 3 and 4, that she stands up for the things that she believes in, probably much more than I ever did. And I think it's. I also wonder, in teaching our grandkids about being about who are the great role models out there, to share with them what we admire in them.
I think that's a great idea. I think the more we share about what we admire in someone, the better the world is. I think we've all spent a long, long time especially in Jewish homes, growing up in these very critical environments where we pointed out everything that was wrong in our opinion. And I think reversing this trend to point out what we admire is a much healthier, it's not like, you know, much healthier. And I also love the idea of, you know, asking grandchildren to identify people they admire, and then to think about, you know, it could be a basketball player, it could be a musician that you've never heard of, but to help them to ask this question, because it could be they just like this person because of the music. It could be they like this person because this person's cool. But maybe having this conversation will help them probe a little deeper and find out, well, I really like this person because this person can actually says words that mean something to me. You know, I'm just saying it's a way, it's a path, it's just a path into a deeper conversation. But I do think that because they have different generations have very different ideas, although many of them are all growing up on the same, you know, the same books and stories and great myths and characters of history, and that are often fascinating. I've been watching. I don't watch any TV or series because I'm just so busy, but I have been watching Servant of the People, which is Zelensky's Volodymyr Zelensky's show, and he's a history teacher who becomes president of Ukraine, and he's constantly in conversation with great historical figures like Plutarch and you know, Abraham Lincoln and Caesar, and it's just kind of fascinating to see that, you know, how he plays with that and put that into the show. So
it's amazing. I think we have a question, Terry.
Yeah. First of all, we have a comment from Lisa, who says, you know, what does Lisa respect and admire about her own grandchild? And she says, because she's kind. So that's a comment. And then a question from Raphael Rob, who asks, is there a particular trait that is common to all RBG's role models? Is there a special quality within each role model? And Rob adds, I happen to be writing a book about 7 role models for our grandkids, and I've tried to find what is numinous in each of them, a soul trait that is unique to each of them. So the question is, are there character traits that are common?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, I have to say that kindness is probably one of the most important traits that, you know, we want to identify and find in people. And just in general, to me, it's one of the traits I admire the most. There are so many different women in this book. There's really ends up being like 34 women, including Justice Ginsburg. But I did, this book had very specific criteria, and I'll read this to you because I went back and looked at some of my early notes for the book, and the criteria for women we chose were a woman who defied the stereotypes of her time to be a pioneer or amazing success in her field, or who saved people, made discoveries, or created positive change in the world. She refused to be defined by the expectations and limitations of her time. Her path paved the way for the advancement of women and or influenced the trajectory of the Jewish people and or all people. She was not male defined. She was not only a good and patient wife, a martyr, or a victim. She was a woman whose life and achievements in the face of gender discrimination and other obstacles we can learn from and be inspired by today. She was and is a role model. So that was the point of the women that we chose for the book. So there's two things I want to say. One is, I think it's really important to have a conversation with your grandchildren about gender equity. If this book is about anything, the message is gender equity, and that gender equity, despite the fact that we're all kind of complacent about it, certainly has not occurred in the United States. It hasn't occurred in lots of other places besides the United States, but the United States is supposed to be one of the pinnacles of democracy, and we want it to be that way. And there are so many reasons why we need gender equity enshrined in the Constitution. But first, we have to be aware that we don't have gender equity. So when I had this early draft of the book, I gave it to a number of young readers to read. I want to point out that, and by the way, boys and girls, I want to point out that not a single one of them knew that their great grandmas could not have a credit card in their name or couldn't buy a piece of property if they were married, and on and on and on and on. Top of that, they were all, by the way, they were either all children of people I know. They were all children of very highly educated parents, and they all went to great schools, and they're all really smart kids. They didn't really know that that there wasn't gender equity today. They just like not even a topic. It's like not something that they thought about at all. Just, well, we have the same sports teams. There's no reason. There's nothing. They just don't know. So I think it's really important to have a conversation that there's a long way to go for gender equity to occur. We do not have an amendment in the Constitution, whether it's called the ERA or the XYZ or the BQD, that shows that that gives women the same rights that men have. And there are lots of reasons why that's important. We also don't have many other things, like women still getting better. It's getting better, but women are still not paid at the same level as men. And there are lots of other reasons why there's lots of laws on the books. Like, for example, there's a law in one city that I used to live where women are not allowed to wear pants. Well, yes, that's not enforced, but there are other laws that could be enforced. So there's so many reasons, including like in terms of voting rights, why women need to have. So I'm working on this project now, which is really inspired by her, which is the road to gender equity. And as parents and grandparents, we really have to make sure this message is shared with have conversations and hear what our kids have to think about it, but let them know this is part of the journey ahead.
Well, I think that's so important. And I guess part of what's important to think is how to have this conversation with both boys and girls. This is just not a conversation to have with girls, but this is something that's even more important to have this conversation, because it just seems to me, I feel like our country is going in a little bit of a different opposite direction. And there needs to be there needs to be mindfulness about the role that we can play as grandparents and family members to move things in a positive direction in this regard.
So you're so right. So this is a book for boys and girls, by the way, or for all genders. And it was a definite decision that was made that way. When we first started talking about the book, by the way, I think Justice Ginsburg was just thinking it was for girls. I gave it to my then 12-year-old nephew to read, and he came back and said, wow, these are all amazing people, Aunt Nadine. I'm wondering, why is it written for, like, why isn't it for me? Because he didn't know that he wasn't supposed to think that these were amazing people. And I went to the justice and said, well, let's not do this. Let's change it. And she said, okay. So we did. And it's really important when we talk about like women and gender equity, like, one of the really important things is, of course, having more women in positions of leadership. It's not just having more women in positions of leadership. It's also having men who appreciate women and understand what women bring to leadership and value that, and also have some of those traits themselves. Again, it comes down to traits. It's not really about gender. You look at the traits in people. There are men who have incredible traits in building consensus, who speak in a tone that encourages conversation, that have many of the traits that one would identify with a woman in leadership. This is a conversation I had with Justice Ginsburg again. She was for a while the only woman on the court. She was the only woman in their private deliberations. The tone of those deliberations when she was the only woman was very difficult for her. She was very often dismissed when she would say something. No one would pay, just like it happened to many other women. No one would pay any attention to her. And then later on, a man would say it and everyone would jump all over the idea. But there was this kind of combative tone, this kind of doing better than the other, outdoing the other person. There was a whole kind of ways the men spoke. When there were more women on the court, that changed. But that's, again, there's many men, like if I had especially men growing up today who don't have that quote unquote combative, have learned not to have that trait, not to have that tone. So again, we're looking for the traits that women bring to power, and they're not only brought by women. Oh, I can't hear you. You got muted. You're on mute.
Sorry, I'm in a hotel and there are noisy people in the hallway. I just think that's so important. And I love the way you phrased it, that these are qualities that are not unique from women, but qualities that we could learn from so many wonderful women. Do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share with us? We're about to wrap up.
Well, a couple of things. One is that this whole book has inspired me to really think about what the road to gender equity is in the United States, because really we're not thinking about it. We're thinking about putting out all the fires, but we have quite a bit of cultural change education to, I think, to accomplish first. And as grandparents, parents, it's really important. I mean, grandparents are in the perfect position to help create that cultural change that will allow us to get to a point where we will have, enough people in Congress who agree that we need to have gender equity in the Constitution, and in other way, all sorts of shapes and forms in leadership. And the other thing is that we do actually have a small contest going on right now for high school kids, if you have high school grandchildren, and it's to write about a role model who's in the book. And it's at maybe it's called the Role Model Project. Hold on a second. I'll have to get you the address. I'll promise to give the address to Terry and David so that we can follow up with it. And it's, I think, through the middle of May. So it's just a very easy contest, like, a 400-word contest, but I think it's sweet. And whoever the winners will be published on Moment's website at momentmag.com. So.
Great. Thank you so much. This has really been quite wonderful. Terry, to you.
Nadine, I just found the link to the role model project and put it in.
You are
into
so
chat.
fast. I'm impressed.
Nimble fingers.
Terry
Yes.
is my role model.
Mine too.
Love that man and that woman. We are going to wrap up. We're going to end now. I want to just let you know that we're going to send you all the recording because we want you to have it and you can share it with friends and colleagues and so on. We will also, so we'll follow up with the recording and some other information on Thursday. I hope that you will consider joining our Facebook group. Those of you who are not part of it, it's just a loving, supportive, wonderful group of friends. And it's growing nicely. Meanwhile, Nadine and David and Ruth, and to all of you, thank you so much for a most wonderful conversation. It's been a great pleasure. And to all of our friends who joined us tonight, thank you for giving your time and giving your evening. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. See you soon.
Also, oh, you can get signed copies of the book at momentmag.com.
I'll include that in the follow-up
Yes.
email as well.
Okay.
All right,
Wonderful.
thank you.
Good night, everybody. Take care.
Good night.
Bye.
Good
Thank you. It was
night.
so great to see all of you.